Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with Dr. Aaron Donaldson today, standing in for David. We are going to discuss, the first thing we're going to discuss is the very good news of at least a temporary ceasefire. Nobody wants to call it a ceasefire because ceasefire is apparently a radical concept these days, but a humanitarian pause and exchanges of prisoners and hostages between Hamas and Israel. So far, it's gone pretty well. Humanitarian relief has been able to get into the West Bank. Pardon me, not the West Bank. Well, maybe there too, but the Gaza, and even into the northern parts. There was actually a brief delay in the exchange, prisoner exchange, at one point because the Hamas wanted to make sure that the humanitarian aid could get into the northern part of Gaza, which of course would be a deterrence towards further Israeli bombing. This in a conflict that started with a massive attack on across the Israeli border, killing about 1,200 people and leading to the capture of about 240 hostages. A lot of the victims of both were children. And then Israel responded, as usual, with airstrikes that have killed, I believe we're at somewhere around 13 or 14,000 right now, more than all of the conflicts between 2008 up till now combined, including the bloody one in 2014. It seems like Israel feels like it needs to kill 10 times as many people as are killed, and I think we're at that point. This was the largest killing of Jewish civilians since World War II, and it was certainly horrific. But it's so there's been a lot of discussion. Even left-wingers such as Bernie Sanders and others have said, well, how do you negotiate a ceasefire with a terrorist organization that's dedicated to perpetual war? But somehow it happened, and it's actually kind of a miracle. And Biden had been held his cards very close to his chest, he and his team, because he did not condemn Israel, certainly, did not even call for a ceasefire, didn't use those terms. But apparently, behind the scenes, he did put some pressure on Netanyahu when there were some difficulties putting this together. They brought Qatar into it, also Egypt, but Qatar in particular was very involved in brokering this temporary ceasefire or humanitarian pause, whatever you want to call it. But it might have fallen apart at any moment. Because there was a lot of problems with both sides here trying to reach this agreement. The hope is, because now they've extended the humanitarian pause in exchange for more releases, the hope is that maybe some type of longer term peace, or well, not peace, but lack of violence can be negotiated, and maybe that will put an end to this particular chapter. But if you go to Wikipedia and you look up the timeline of Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Israeli-Arab conflict, I mean, you go all the way back to even before 1948, and it's just there's stuff going on every year. Several big incidents of people on both sides being killed, either by terrorism, assassination, bombing, or something or another. Something has got to break the cycle. But right now, I think Biden is just focused on this one moment by moment. But have to give credit to him. I did not support him in the primaries in 2020. And, there's a lot I don't like about him, but you have to give him credit. He finessed this. His team finessed something that actually did seem impossible. And I suggest people go read about what happened behind the scenes. It's not done yet, and they could be back to fighting, next week. But at least there's something has been accomplished here, some humanitarianism, some release of people on both sides. Aaron?
Well, I think, and obviously, any time that the shooting stops, we're at a better place than we are when it's going on.
Right.
And anyone who's involved with orchestrating any kind of ceasefire should be celebrated in that activity, pretty much, bar none. But I think that one of the things that we need to focus on is the way that Biden, in particular, but just the Democratic Party in general, and they're not alone on this, but just speaking to the party in question here at the moment. There's been fairly unconditional support for Israel during what is tantamount to a historic moment of criminal activity when it comes to a 10-to-1 ratio of those killed. And I think that when they rhetorically compare it to the Holocaust and when they rhetorically compare it to 9/11, these kinds of discursive moves, just speaking from the field of communication studies, they evoke a moment of real disproportionate response. Like, there's no negotiating with Nazis. There's no negotiating with the Taliban, as the rhetoric went in 2001. And what we got from that was a war on terror that went for decades across two countries, removed millions of people from their homes, killed hundreds of thousands of people, definitely did not stop terrorism, nor end the Taliban's reign or any of that, didn't do any of that. And the Democrats are, willing to continue to unconditionally fund Israel when they rhetorically draw on these moments in order to asymmetrically punish an entire region of people for terrorist activity. And I think that these moments of ceasefire need to be celebrated. But within that kind of context, I think that everyone can agree that there just has to be a lot more done to limit Israel's responses in these moments.
Let me ask you this. Had Biden publicly denounced Israel or even publicly pushed for a ceasefire, could he have accomplished this? I mean, it was very intricate, behind the scenes, and it almost fell apart several times. And what they're saying, what analysts are saying, is that it wasn't so much that Biden even supports what Israel is doing; he doesn't. But that had he done what much of the left and some Democrats want him to do, that maybe there would still be mega death going on right this minute.
I think in the short term, that's definitely true. I don't think that you can decouple United States military support from the activity going on in Israel.
Sure.
And if the Democrats were ever serious about, tying the purse strings to limiting this kind of activity, I think we would see, at least significantly less enthusiastic types of war crime going on. I think it's been really, outrageous, public, and atrocious. And again, it's evocative of the United States' efforts following 2001. I don't want to insulate my own country here.
Yeah.
But to get to your question, as an academic, I have the luxury of not having to, worry so much about politics. Whether or not he gets reelected on that platform, I don't know. That could be political suicide for him. And it would definitely send a lot of signals to a lot of people, particularly Netanyahu's crew in Israel and things, that they would exploit in order to really ratchet up that pressure. So, in the short term, I think it's safe to say that it would have seemed fairly fruitless. It probably would not, like Israel's backlash probably would have been more substantial and immediate because the rhetoric of crisis would have gone up quite a bit in that circumstance. We're losing our funding. But over the long haul, I think that is the stance that is necessary. I think that's what we have to do if we want to see this kind of stuff stop.
Does Israel even really need that funding? I mean, they didn't have the funding. They had funding from de Gaulle in 1967 when Golda Meir, said the leader of Israel at the time, said, I don't like de Gaulle, but I deal with the devil himself. I don't care if de Gaulle's the devil himself. We need these weapons right now, or we're going to fall. And this was, of course, when Egypt and Syria and other countries that were formidable military forces were going to attack them. And, you could talk about this is not the same thing. They're not up against organized military force, in that the Hamas certainly doesn't have airplanes. They've got hang gliders, as we know from that really creepy video of people, kids dancing in the rave, and you see the hang gliders in the background. It's just like something out of a horrible movie, and the rest. But they don't have airplanes. They've got rockets that are inaccurate, and so all they can do is really kill civilians, really, because they don't have military application, and the rest. So, as we say, it's asymmetric, and so the question is, does Israel even really need that military aid, or is it symbolic? I don't know, and I'm not a military expert, so I don't know.
Neither am I. What I would say is, if they don't need it, as a debate coach, I know a lot of debate programs that could use the billions of dollars that we have given Israel every single year under the pretense of it being like the bulwark against, an onslaught of aggression in the region. Their language has always been very, explicit that that's what they need. When you look at the kinds of planes, when you look at the kinds of ordnance, when you look at the kind of, technology, intelligence, surveillance, and infrastructure that they use, when you look at the Iron Dome, you're looking not only at the dollars that we are putting into the infrastructure within Israel, but you're also looking at lots of very lucrative weapons contracts that go right back into American coffers over the spans of decades. And I think that if you don't have those contracts getting the same kinds of munitions, getting the same kinds of surveillance, you would see a significant decrease in capacity. Could Israel continue to disproportionately target a group that relies on, yes, literal hang gliders in order to execute air power? I think they could. I think that, they're a nation that has enough support and enough people that are willing to support them, regardless of what they do, that they could asymmetrically punish Hamas and all of the people within the region without the United States support. But we can't overestimate what billions of dollars and also lucrative contracts with the most sophisticated weapons and surveillance and intelligence contractors on earth give them. It's a lot.
Well, the argument I've heard is that it's not really to fight Hamas, but to deter involvement from the other Arab countries. But we certainly know Egypt has lost their appetite for it. We'll talk about Rosalind Carter later in the show, but her husband negotiated what can be considered the only lasting peace there. Is Egypt, in fact, by some reports, tried to warn Israel that something was happening. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but they knew that there was a lot of chatter and something was up. And the fact that with those warnings that rave was even allowed to happen, some of the more cynical conspiracy theorists are saying that was Netanyahu. But the focus of our show is American politics, and you're right. I think Biden loses either way. He's going to lose voters over this. He's probably not going to gain voters over this, and he doesn't know how to sell something. I mean, this was probably one of the most intricate works of diplomacy ever. But he doesn't sell it. His people don't sell it, and you'd say, well, that just shows that he's got, people say, well, he's not a braggart like Trump. It's like, yeah, well, Trump will probably win because he put his name on the I don't know if he's going to win, but he put his name on the checks that were being sent out, right? He wanted to make sure that his signature was on it. So, you got to sell it. You got to be willing to do it if you're going to be in politics. And this was, if you read the accounts, there's some really interesting accounts of what happened. It just seems absolutely like if they did it any different way, it might not have gone as well. It may be why Bernie Sanders was even refusing to say ceasefire at that point, because there were probably intelligence. They were probably being informed in Congress through their proper committees, and so they wanted to see if they could have some sort of influence. And the problem is Netanyahu needs this war to stay out of jail, to stay in office, although there does seem to be some indication that once this war is over, he may not be able to hold office, especially since they are seeing this as possibly his incompetence with regard to, in particular, the Egyptian intelligence warnings.
This may be a non-issue, but do you think that the budget fight, the fact that there's still not a guaranteed package for either Israel or Ukraine, uh,
Yeah.
does that play at all here, or is that
Yeah,
just kind of sit
I
to the
don't
side?
know. The Republicans all have their own problems. I mean, they've got people. I remember Pat Buchanan in the 1990s opposing any aid to Israel because it's socialist to the core, which at that
Yeah.
time it was, and maybe still is to some degree. I mean, what was attacked was a kibbutz, a Mapam kibbutz, not an artsy kibbutz, not one of the more radical ones, but definitely socialistic, if not socialist. Yeah, I don't know. And then again, there's just raw anti-Semitism that plays into it, and a lot of the Republican base are of the anti-Semitic sort who blame Jews for killing Christ as opposed to other things. But I'll let you close it out.
I think there's a long laundry list of grievances there for sure. My only thought on that was just that, until they have a guaranteed funding package, there may be, a little need to buy some time. And what would be interesting to me, you'd mentioned how easily this ceasefire could unravel. And when you're dealing with an organization like Hamas, accountability is almost impossible to achieve, let alone when you look at the many branches of the Israeli Defense Force. But I think that it would be interesting if they were to pass a budget that were to guarantee, unconditional aid to Israel if the ceasefire were to continue. Because in those circumstances, I think that would be pretty significant. It would show, maybe that it is time. Israel cannot do this forever. They know that.
No.
They will do it frequently, but they will not do it forever. And at some point, it will have to stop. And the question is, what comes next? That's going to be a big issue, obviously.
Videos on social media show pro-Palestinian demonstrators at this New York City college chanting "Free Palestine," with Jewish students in the school library standing in fear as the demonstrators banged on those doors. At Cornell University in New York State, it turned vile. Graffiti such as this, mild, compared to brutally specific death threats posted online to rape and shoot Jews, even to behead Jewish babies. Police have now arrested a Cornell student on a federal criminal complaint. As for Jewish students at the university,
for my family last night, we had a discussion whether it's safe for me to be on campus or whether I should come back home.
Okay, related topic at home. Last week we actually discussed. Dave and I were at the Democratic convention, and we discussed massive protests there that actually shut down the event for Saturday night. There are protests all over. Those were very peaceful protests, relatively speaking, but they haven't all been peaceful. Some very unfortunate incidents have happened, and we've had actually death here. In between the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, a child was stabbed by his crazy landlord who had been listening to right-wing hate radio for weeks on end, and he was a 6-year-old child. Horrible event. And unfortunately, about a week later, a Jewish woman who's the president of the board of one of the synagogues in Detroit was stabbed in a similar manner outside of her home. Was it a retaliation, copycat type thing? We'll never know, but you can't exclude that possibility. Those are the more extreme events that have happened, but Muslims have been attacked in this country, and so have Jews. And in fact, the attacks on both of them have gone up over the past 7 years. And again, there's different forms of anti-Semitism. Again, if you're Christian and you have a literal belief in the Bible and you read the book of John and it says the Jews, did this, so didn't even blame the Roman Empire. Pilate just is like Pontius Pilate is seen as this person who's just caught in between, and so they as opposed whereas the other synoptic gospels say the scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees, the book of John just tossed all that and said, the Jews did this. The Jews did this to Jesus Christ. And that has led to 2,000 years of or at least it intensified the anti-Semitism, and then it goes into blood libel and the rest. Then you do have some anti-Semitism coming from the left, and we've discussed that on this show. People who are, there's even a joke, a meme on it of the good witch from The Wizard of Oz saying, "Are you a good Jew or a bad Jew?" I mean, and there are now lawsuits being filed, and a number of major law firms actually sent letters to all of the Ivy League colleges warning them that lawsuits are coming if you don't get this under control on campus. One of the more disturbing sights we've seen was some young men in yarmulkes in New York University, and a group of protesters, some of them Palestinian, some of them white, started banging on the windows at them and yelling things at them because they're wearing yarmulkes. And you have no idea what their position is on Israel. It was presumed that they're wearing a yarmulke, that they must, be a political enemy. And this is a very scary thing. And right now, according to Politico, Jewish groups are suing University of California over unchecked anti-Semitism. People where some of the Jewish students are afraid to go to classes. And for a number of reasons, and I'll get into some of the details. It is scary, but so you've got this, and there's a lot of misunderstandings about what Israel even represents. People are shocked when I tell them, you understand that only about 1/3 of Israel is Ashkenazi by any reasonable definition. That is, at least half white, from Europe. You've got another half of the Jewish population that is Sephardic or Asian or Ethiopian Jewish, and then you've got 20% Arabs that live there, non-Jewish Arabs, and so it's not there's this understanding that that I believe is oversimplifying, that this is just another example of European white colonialism. I don't think it's that simple. I think it's an element of it, but it's also much more complicated. And with that, but certain things are being pushed, certain lines are being pushed in the schools that, Jews aren't really oppressed because they're white. That's not universally true, and there's privilege that they have if they pass as white, but these lawsuits are saying they need protection too. And I'm going to let you respond, and then I'll go into some of the details of the lawsuits. Aaron.
I'll be interested to hear the details. Just based on what I have found, some of the fundamental links that they're talking about is stances that universities have against, like, Zionism in particular. Like, right. And I think that we need to be very clear when we separate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because there's a well-documented and strategic effort to kind of muddle these waters, to make any critique of the nation of Israel and the activities of the nation of Israel, which will include, in case people missed our first segment, ratios like 10-1 against civilians for a terrorist activity that civilians had absolutely nothing to do with. They had nothing to do with that. And yet the hospitals are being bombed and destroyed, and the people of Gaza are paying the price while the whole world watches. Like, critiquing Israel right now, feeling angry at the activity of the Israeli government right now is justified. It is warranted. And I think if you look at the history of this activity, that means that there can be reasons that a lot of folks would want folks that come to speak on their campus to be critical of the nation of Israel, and that is not inherently anti-Semitic. I think when we talk about anti-Semitism as a rhetorical structure, as a form of actual hate speech, when you look at the people that are responsible for that within the United States, and you look at the people that they impact, here you do see a very large overlap. And you may find it overly simplistic, but I think there's a huge overlap of white supremacy and colonial white supremacy in particular. Confederates and Nazis are not the same, but they do share fundamental genealogies when it comes to who isn't and isn't who is and is not a belonger. And when you look at Judaism, as you have noted, the conversation about whether a Jew who is white, very much like us Italians, can be very complex. And depending on when and where you ask that question, you're going to get a pretty complicated answer. Right. But it will frequently be one that is associated with threats of violence, with threats of extermination. And I think those are the threats that we should all be aware of. I do not know any university at all that is not willing to immediately address those threats. I think in many ways our universities lead the charge in identifying and addressing oppressive forms of hate speech that are actual forms of hate speech. But when it comes to folks feeling afraid to go to school, if they're being harassed, then that has to stop, and educators have to stop that, and no one is going to justify that. But there are a lot of people every day who are afraid to go to school. And that's not justifying it. That's just saying that there's consequences of inhabiting the identities that we do. And that in and of itself is not a sign that everyone is out to get you. And I worry that that's what a lot of these lawsuits are representing, is this kind of conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Because again, I have not found a single moment where a university is like, swastikas, like, what are you going to do? There's nothing wrong with that. Like, they address that immediately. They respond to that. But they will deplatform people who will come to campus and make these kinds of conflations. And I think that that's justifiable. I think they should be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, what the lawsuit I think has some good points and bad points from what I'm seeing. Now, I haven't read the actual complaint, but really Politico's summary of it. Okay, so the obvious incidents that are of concern, whether or not you can blame it on the university itself or just the overall difficulty of the situation, but a Jewish student draped in an Israeli flag was attacked by protesters who hit him in the head with a metal water bottle. Okay, no doubt that is wrong and inappropriate. And I won't even go to speculate as to whether or not he did some aggression first. If that is accurate, then that is wrong.
If the university is culpable for that, then by all means they should be held accountable.
Hate emails, no discipline for hate emails calling for their gassing and murder. Okay, that is a legitimate concern. If they are not punishing them the same way that they would punish people for using the N-word or anything like that, then that is absolutely fine.
I don't want to interrupt, but I will jump in. I know colleagues and I know fellow students that have gotten emails that have threatened their murder. We're talking, Black women and Arab women and queer folks get these emails, and the students get reprimanded, but they don't get kicked out. They do not get removed from the university. This is not treated like a legitimate threat, and those people go to school every day and they are afraid. And I think that the university could do more to protect them. But again, this isn't unique to Jews, and this is not a form of explicit anti-Semitism.
They're claiming that there is no discipline in this case. And I don't know if that's true, but if it is true, it's problematic. And I'm not saying the students should automatically be kicked out. They're entitled to hearings and the rest, but the investigation and hearings should happen.
I think they do.
Right. The law, and there are probably a lot of details of lawsuit and discovery that's going to come out. Where I just disagree with the lawsuit, although I think we also do need to distinguish between the concept of Zionism and the state of Israel as well, because there's actually an organization called the Progressive Zionist Association that is critical of Israel, and they're even participating in the protests. They don't reveal that they're Zionists, but to them, Zionism simply means that Jews needed a homeland following the Holocaust. Now, my thought has always been, okay, but why down in Palestine? Why not give them a chunk of Germany? I mean, if anybody is at fault, they were more at fault than certainly the Palestinians. Yes, I know that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem made an alliance with Hitler and the rest, but that was leadership. I think most Palestinians didn't even know what Nazis were, let alone, being able to ally with them. We didn't have, there wasn't a lot of good media there for them to be familiar with that, but there was, for instance, some official groups that were being allowed to flourish that said, okay, Jews can be in, but not if you're a Zionist, I think you can argue, well, that's not necessarily a discrimination against Jews, because probably any white, black, or even Arab person who said would be a Zionist would be done too. And so it's a discrimination based on a perspective rather than something else. Whether the discrimination is appropriate is separate from whether or not it's legal. There isn't a lot of legal protection for people with a certain perspective. Again, we will see how they are, but these organizations have a First Amendment right to choose their speakers based on the viewpoint. It's a member. So again, are we talking about being a part of a group or being invited to speak and the rest? Well, there should be no shortage of speaking opportunities for any group that wants to invite a Zionist in, right? I mean, and if they aren't being allowed to speak, that's a different question than whether or not they're being excluded from groups. So there's a lot of nuances to address in these lawsuits, but there's nothing nuanced about hitting somebody over the head with a metal bottle.
It's self-serving, but I just want to reiterate that when it comes to the institutions in question here, we're talking about folks that are literally doing the work to describe not only what anti-Semitism is as a form of structural hate speech, and this isn't a subjective question, this is a structural question and a question of history and evidence, and we can look at that. And then we're also seeing the same groups doing the same work that is proving that there is a strategic effort to muddy the water, to justify, Israeli offensive efforts under the vague frame that in interrogating it at all is a form of anti-Semitism. And it's a very thin line and a careful question. But when you look at the attacks on academia from the right, when you look at the way that academia is misrepresented, again, I would be shocked if there's someone getting hit on the head for being Jewish at a major university and the university is not investigating this. Yeah. I would be shocked. I would be shocked if they're getting death threats and they're not investigating that. From what I have heard, from what I've read, these are not the claims. The claims are students feel afraid to go to school. And again, I want to say there's more that we can do to build structures of tolerance and inclusion in our communities that level the field there. But that's not unique to Jews. And two, that when it comes to like really trying to decide what these issues are, I think we should lean on evidence. We should not lean on the feelings of individual students. We should not lean on this allegorical time where one person had one thing happen to them. We should lean on the research, and that's what these institutions are doing. And unless the people that are talking about this, on the news, as someone who has sat in on these committees, I'm willing to tell you this is work that happens, and we're not ignorant to this. So I'm very curious to see what the accountability error is on behalf of the university, and if it is just deplatforming Zionists, I'm not super concerned.
The interesting thing is I know a woman and I have discussions with her all the time, somewhat intense sometimes. We've been friends since college. She is radical to my left on all kinds of issues, but she is a self-avowed Zionist who intends to retire. She's a professor at the University of Kentucky, and she intends to retire in Israel. And she is somebody who says, the left has this line that it's the marginalized people who determine whether or not something is oppressive and not up to the rest of society. They are the ones who are the best arbiters as to whether it is, and says, and if the majority of them feel that these attacks on Zionism in general are that, why is that different than, say, a African American saying that it's racist to attack Black Islam? So it's a question to consider.
For what it's worth, I think she's evoking Bell Hooks' notion of theory from the margins. And theory from the margins is a place where you vocalize your oppression from marginal space. And that is how oppressed folks are given any credibility at all, let alone ability to write policy and things, which is only a recent development thanks to intersectional feminism in this capacity. But the only the thing that we have to keep in mind here is, once again, we're talking about a perspective as opposed to an identity. You're not born a Zionist. That's not something that exists as part of your identity. And I think that that's fundamental when it comes to the theory from the margins, and to misrepresent or conflate that or act like that's not baked into the theory means they either just didn't do the reading or they don't understand identity politics at an intricate level. And again, that's where I think we should lean on literally the very institutions that we're trying to persecute right now. Instead of persecuting them and suing them, we should be like, what do the books say, and help us understand what is and isn't actual anti-Semitism.
Yeah, really quickly, that she would respond that you aren't born into the Nation of Islam either, but some people are saying that attacking the Nation of Islam is racism. I actually disagree with that. I think there's plenty of reasons to, that legitimate reasons to attack the Nation of Islam, but not for its belief system, but for certain other things. But
to use the word the Nation of Islam in the same way as we're using the term the Nation of Israel is kind of a misnomer that we just do not have time to unpack right now.
Right.
But I will say that fundamentally Islamophobia itself, that is an identity. Like someone who is born to appear as though they are a Muslim, whether they are or not doesn't matter for Islamophobia's sake. If they appear to be a Muslim, that is a way you are born. That's not a choice that you make. And that's not true for Zionism.
No, but it is true for Jews.
It is true for Jews, absolutely, which is why anti-Semitism is a legitimate thing that we spend a lot of time studying.
Complicated discussion. We'll have to have it again.
I receive so much mail. Every week I receive maybe 2,000 letters. And daily I receive letters from older citizens who feel that they have been left out of our society. And particularly those, because they know that I'm concerned about mental health problems, I receive mail particularly from those about this issue and from families of those who have older citizens in their families who have mental health problems. And the harsh reality about our present system of mental health care is that for too many professionals and in too many programs, the elderly do not exist. Our commission was shocked to find that while as many as 25% of our older citizens may suffer from significant mental health problems, very few actually receive adequate treatment.
All right, for the last segment, I wanted to discuss Rosalind Carter. Again, Rosalind Carter is not considered to be a leftist, not one of the typical heroes that I would want to give tribute to, but I actually find her fascinating. I actually think that Jimmy Carter, his presidency is actually one of the most underrated and maligned in the history. As we discussed earlier, he negotiated the only lasting peace. The Camp David Accords are really something. It got a leader of one country killed. That shows how profound it was. And it has probably prevented wars from expanding beyond Hamas and Hezbollah ever since. But I wanted to talk a bit about her. I've read some things about her. She, of course, passed away. Kind of surprised everybody that she died before her husband, who's been in hospice care for some very serious cancer for a long time. They were in their 90s. I believe she died in 96. But she's seen as having transformed what a first lady is. And I even read one essay that I disagree with that says that she was the first out feminist first lady. I don't think that's the case because I think we didn't have the word feminism back when Eleanor Roosevelt was.
Or Abigail Adams for that reason. Yeah.
Right.
For that matter. Yeah.
Well, there you go. Right. Yeah. So.
She'd have some thoughts on this.
I think that whoever wrote that maybe went back as far as Jackie Kennedy, who I don't think was a feminist, but but she was in a quiet way a feminist. She was an advocate for mental health that could be interpreted as having changed the whole way we approach it. She didn't invent the changes, but she promoted it from her pulpit. And we do have a better idea of a system if we're ever willing to fund and implement it because of her. We don't have the mental health system isn't like the one flew over the cuckoo's nest with Nurse Ratched anymore. At least in most places, it's not. And we owe that to a certain degree to the education and the promotion and the grant that she helped get set up to do this. We have we do have potential, and we know because in certain European countries that mental health can be promoted, could actually be treated in a more effective way than we're willing to do it right now. But So we're grateful to her for that. She helped form the Carter, what is it, not the association, but the Carter, it's a nonprofit named after them. And she also, Carter Center, thank you. Yeah, I should remember that because there was the Ford Center too. But the Carter Center, which is, which again promotes a lot of things that progressives would know. He, of course, is considered, even right wingers concede that he might not have been a very good president, but he's the best ex-president. Habitat for Humanity. I actually, a woman I dated in college went to work for them. She was amazed by it. I remember there was a hurricane in a town in Florida, and 7 of the homes that were built by Habitat for Humanity. They were the only 7 in that particular village that survived the hurricane. A lot of, and then of course human rights and elections, and that he was involved with, was he considered her to be her equal partner. And he said that in his eulogy, and it sounds like today, that sounds like, well, that's not, of course their spouse is equal, but at the time it wasn't. You had, Eleanor Roosevelt did do a lot of stuff on her own. She was also slammed for it, and the rest, and in very sexist way. And I'll even say that this Ms. Reagan was slammed for it in a very sexist way, and we all know how Hillary Clinton was treated. But apparently she reintroduced, I don't think she introduced, but reintroduced the concept of an active first lady. Whatever you want to think about that term. I think it's worth taking some time to talk about her, because she never held office, but she was a leader, and it had made a mark in a quieter way than other people.
So Aaron Glantz is the senior editor of the Fuller Project. He's got a profile on Democracy Now! Where he talks about the impact that she had on journalism in particular when it comes to mental health. And I think that you're right to say that none of this is stuff that she, necessarily created, but a good leader doesn't, come up with all the good ideas. A good leader is someone who listens, and here's the people that are right, and here's the people who are maybe being talked over and ignored when they shouldn't be. And in this particular issue, at least, this was something that she did throughout her entire career in politics when it comes to mental health. And the consequences are significant. Just in here, in this moment, in the conversation, we are calling it mental health, as opposed to like insanity or being crazy. Those are ableist terms that journalists and doctors and a lot of other people relied upon before the concept of stigmatization was well understood. And in the 1960s, Irving Goffman, in particular in the field of comm, that's who we look at when it comes to stigma, is the person who's doing the work to kind of describe how deviations from the norm create cultural realities that are catastrophic for some populations. Veterans is a good example here, because Glantz talks about how folks like the Department of Defense would not even study veteran suicide because they just thought it was like, a moral failure, or it had something to do with, the alcoholism or any of these other things that the individual was undergoing. They were participating within that stigmatization. And so the fact that we now know that 22 veterans a day commit suicide, and that number is tracked by the DOD, that's a product of the legislation that was passed during this administration's time to look at the way that we secure policies for people that suffer from mental health care needs during this time. They weren't tracking that number at the time, but that's a product of that legacy. And so I think that when it comes to revolutionizing the office of the First Lady, I could be wrong, but I think I read somewhere that like she formalized the office of the First Lady. Like there were definitely people married to the president before, but as far as like an actual office within the executive branch, I believe that might have been formalized when she was there. And this is a product of her long-standing relationship with her husband that was, as you said, as far as I can see, very collaborative. She would attend cabinet meetings. She was sent as an envoy to Latin America and things. Like she was very, very engaged and involved. But on the stigma issue, it's hard to overstate the significance. Aaron Glantz was very, very clear. Hundreds of people went through the fellowship program that went on to change the way that we talk about mental health care in this country. Yeah. And that's significant. It means that, like, not only do we have better policy, but the people that are affected that need to reach that policy have better access to that policy. We could just go on and on and on, but from the communication standpoint, that's a contribution that really needs to be remembered, because it took a lot of advocating. It was very easy and continues to be very easy for people to use a kind of, simple moralistic frame when it comes to mental health care. And we still see that problem in our own community right now a lot.
I'll tell you where I kind of became impressed with her. It was after the presidency. I was in high school. The presidency ended halfway through my high school, and I was just starting to pay attention to it. I mean, what I knew about Jimmy Carter is what I saw on the Saturday Night Live skits, right? Where he became the colossal president, all that stuff. But I saw him. I was in college, and I was visiting my grandmother one time, and one of the things my grandmother loved to watch was Phil Donahue. Phil Donahue, of course, was a talk show on television during the 1980s. He turned out to be a lot more progressive than he came across on that show afterwards. But he, or maybe that show made him progressive, I don't know. But he had Jimmy Carter and Rosalind on his show. And I don't even remember what the policy was at this point, but Carter had given his opinion of some policy issue at the time, and she turned to him and said, but that's totally unfair. It leaves out the poorer parts of the country. And they had an argument there, and Phil Donahue was fascinated with it. He just let them argue. They were respectful, old-fashioned ways, but she had a position that was definitely distinct from him, and he was not offended by that and didn't feel like he was being undermined as a man or anything like that, which at the time is probably what a lot of people thought if they were watching it, right? But he simply responded with his arguments, and I thought this is interesting, and it was something that I hadn't seen done, because usually the first ladies I had known up until that were Pat Nixon. Kennedy died before I was born, but that's who I knew. And I knew that Ford's wife was active in some ways, but this was my impression. The first ladies were supposed to be wallflowers, and she clearly was not. And not only were they having that argument, but he was taking her very seriously in it. And and that was sort of like, here I was the hip leftist, they're both mainstream. I'm watching a mainstream show. And yet that was one of the most fascinating moments I'd seen. And I think that kind of stuck with me, and I've kind of paid attention to what she did. Not everybody is a political leader in the sense that they rally people up, but she found a way to be effective in her own quiet way, but also very prominent way.
A lot of people obviously making the comparative to Hillary Clinton, who was arguably more qualified than even her husband was when she ran for president of the United States. And I think that, for me, that is where Rosalind Carter's name comes to my radar, was during the so-called Hillary Care debacle, because I was in high school debating in the 90s, and, Hillary Clinton being this very, very active political person at the time was, nothing new. This wasn't people looking at her like she was stepping out of bounds or doing anything. And she would frequently evoke, Carter's legacy when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to, re-understanding how we think about healthcare at the national level. Securing policy for mental health care was important. Getting the federal government involved at the insurance level. Insurances did not think mental health care was something they needed to cover until the federal government got involved. And when Hillary Care comes along, getting the insurance companies to actually cover the things that they think that they don't need to cover is a big part of what she's after. And so I think that legacy, echoes generationally in a lot of ways. And it is important to say that she's got plenty of places that we could criticize her, but when it comes to, memorializing someone and speaking to the things that we want to see replicated, I just really want to emphasize how focusing on stigma in the 1960s was really important, and how that work coming from the First Lady as opposed to some academic somewhere, who cares what they think, when it comes from, the First Lady's office, when she's the one funding things, when she's the one organizing it, putting her own clout behind it, showing up to the meetings herself and talking to the journalists and things, that creates a normalization process that accelerates way faster than the mere theorists are going to be able to accomplish. And so that matters to me.
Yeah, and again, this is not to say I have plenty of criticisms of the presidency. Although I will say Carter did the right thing when Somoza was about to be overthrown. He did nothing. He didn't send a maid, right? He was a dictator. Somebody had been quoted as his father. I forget what senator, it might have been Vandenberg, but somebody said Somoza may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. This was in the 40s or 50s, and that was sort of the attitude. And Carter said, no, we're not going to send military aid to a despot. So I think he deserves some credit. I don't like what he did in Zaire. I don't like a lot of other things that he did as president, but he did try to reform the CIA. He kicked a bunch of them out. They call it the Halloween Massacre. And curiously enough, as soon as Reagan came to power, they were all right back in there. This is kind of a respect I have for more than I would normally have for a mainstream politician. I just, credit where it's due. I'll let you close it out.
I think all I would do to close it out is just to say that, when these moments come and politicians get together in a room to remember folks, it can be kind of awkward. The photos of Melania Trump and everything, people have been talking about the color of her jacket and all of this. Mm-hmm. And, it's very, very easy to fall back into that. But when it comes to folks like the Carters, they used the office of the presidency after their time there in ways that have inspired people literally across the world to try to do things locally that matter, focusing on really important everyday things like, does your neighbor have a home? Is the person down the street cared for, not quote crazy, but do they have needs that need to be met where, we can help them in affordable and humane ways? That's important. And I'm typically not one to want to eulogize politicians very often. I frequently will spend most of the time stumping on how Carter was in fact a Democrat, and that means there's just not, there's so much we could say. But this legacy in particular, I've said, matters to me as someone studying ableist rhetoric. It's so important to really echo how this stigma language has affected the conversation and the way it's helped.
Eeny, meeny, chili, beanie. The spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
This, again, brings us to predictions. Aaron, what have you got?
I think I'm just wishing it into existence. I just have this gut feeling that Biden's going to have an LBJ moment and shock the world by saying he's not, in fact, running for re-election. It's wishful thinking, I know, but I'm going to throw it out there, and I'm going to say maybe he doesn't run.
Well, that's interesting because that may play into a little bit of my prediction.
This is what I'm thinking too. Now that you mention it, Eric, this is exactly my thought. So you go.
Tomorrow there is going to be a debate on Fox News with Sean Hannity moderating between California Governor Newsom and Florida Governor DeSantis. Newsom had proposed this months ago. DeSantis refused to do it, but now he's kind of desperate. He's looking for some type of long pass. I think it's just going to bury him. I'm not a big fan of Newsom in a lot of ways, but one thing he is brilliant. His debate with Matt Gonzalez way back when he was going for a Green Party member, and that was actually a pretty close election for a mayor of San Francisco, was one of the most top-rate debates I've seen between candidates. I just don't see how DeSantis survives it politically. I think it's going to be, I am predicting it's going to be the end of DeSantis's campaign and, well, maybe the beginning of another if your prediction comes true. We'll see.
All I'm going to say is, as a debate coach, Sean Hannity moderating a debate, that should be illegal. That should just be against the law. That's all I have to say.
We'll see how it goes. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.